So, what befell the Medinan Jews? Were they all expelled or killed during the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad? I think the answer to that is no. But it's complicated and we will go into that in detail. I'll start with a couple of epigraphic texts from northern Hijaz. They're very well known for many specialists in ancient and late ancient Arabia, but they might be new to some of you. Then I will go to other evidence after that, and the Quran also, of course, plays a big role. And I'm very happy that today afternoon we have really spoken about Medinan Jews quite a bit. That's a theme that has come up quite often. So, oh yeah, now we have it moving. All right. So the Jews and Judaism come early to the northern Hijaz, to the northern parts of the Western Arabian Peninsula. This is the first dated text, very famous JSNAP 4. It's dated to 42 or 43 Common Era, and it mentions that a Jew has been buried there. It's a grave funerary inscription. What is important to note here is that this is even before the destruction of the Second Temple. It's quite often the case that the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 Common Era is somehow ascribed as a reason for migration of Jews to Arabian Peninsula, but it seems that this started early on, even earlier than that. In addition to migration, I think we have also conversion happening in the Arabian Peninsula, so these two sort of phenomena coexist. There's quite a bit of epigraphic evidence of Jews in northern Arabia for this period. I'm just going to show these two because they're important. This one, which was published in 2018 by Laila Neme, found by the Saudi team Faraq al-Sahra, is important because it mentions, it's in a mixture of Aramaic and Arabic, which is quite common in late Nabatean inscriptions, such as this one. But it's important because it mentions a Jewish feast, Yawm Hajj al-Fatir, which you can find here, Yawm Hajj al-Fatir, and that specific feast, the Passover, is in Arabic. So it would seem to me that on the basis of this inscription, there were 300 years before the time of the Prophet Muhammad, there were some Arabic-speaking Jews around, at least one, this figure, Shulai, son of Aushu. And nicely, he also dated his inscription. We also have another inscription by the same figure, but it doesn't have any religious content, so I won't mention it here. So just remember that 300 years before the life of the Prophet Muhammad, we have already seem to have Arabic-speaking Jews in the Hijaz. As I mentioned, Jewish inscriptions are quite many from the period before 400 in the north, but they're very rare for the period after that, for reasons that are not well understood. Of course, in the south, we have quite a few Sabæic inscriptions, Jewish Sabæic inscriptions. So at least in some parts of the peninsula, we have sort of continuous evidence of continuous presence of Jews there. These are basically the three only inscriptions from the north that I know of. All are dated on the basis of paleography. All are simply names, so they don't really provide us much evidence, but at least they seem to show that there were some Jews still writing their names on rocks. All right. So jumping to the time of the Prophet Muhammad, here's the timeline that we're dealing with. Supposing, as I do, that we can trust to a certain degree the conventional view of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, and get some dates from there. So first of all, the Meccan period in the Quran, we have mostly positive descriptions of the Israelites and those given the scripture before, and other variations of the name. Then we have the Hijra in the year 1, and we have a text called the Constitution of Medina that we will look at later. Of course, it's a modern name for that text, modern sort of anachronistic name for that text, but it's deemed authentic by the vast majority of the scholars, and it's actually pretty important for my arguments here. Then we have, in the Medinan Quran, we have quite a bit of polemics against the Jews, also quite a bit of engagement with Jewish tradition, as we've seen in Poinses Holger's talk today. And somehow, somewhere here, we have the so-called break with the Jews, and this is a concept that I will problematize and try to deconstruct when, according to the sira, the 3 great Jewish tribes of Medina are expelled from Medina or killed, and then we have the Khaybar raid also. Interestingly, after Muhammad's death, in the earliest non-Arabic sources, the Jews, or some Jews, let's say, emerge as some sort of allies or sympathetic to the conquerors. So how to make sense of all this? I will first note, go through the material in the Quran, and then I'll suggest some solutions to this problem. So this is the break in the sira literature as it's told there, and in most scholarship. You have these 3 tribes, Banu Qaynuqa, Banu Nadir, Banu Qurayda, either expelled or killed. And then we have the raid on Khaybar, which is sort of like Act 2 on the expulsion of the Banu Nadir. And quite common is the view in scholarship that there were no Jews left in Medina, maybe anywhere in the Arabian Peninsula. And here are a couple of quotations by from the work of Ayman Ibrahim and Subhash Inamdar, showing that sort of conventional view as it's in the majority of the scholarship. All right. So, for this conference, I gave myself a task to read the 7 long ones according to the mean verse length, so more or less chronologically, which would put them in this order. Conventionally, and I think credibly, 6 and 7 are Meccan for the most part, at least. There might be Medinan insertions, Medinan additions to them. So, like I mentioned, in the Meccan Quran, most instances of the Israelites are actually positive. And what is also interesting in these passages, quite a few of them, is that it is said that the Israelites, or those that have been given the scripture before, those that read the scripture actually believe in Muhammad's message as well, which is quite interesting. In Medina, there's quite a clear change, and I would argue it starts from the early Medinan period, but it never becomes categorical even at the very latest stage of the Medinan material. And just to mention also the nomenclature in the Quran, how, and of course you all know this, but I would emphasize that all of these terms are very positive. Ahlul Kitab, which seems to be a Quranic sort of coinage, the people of the scripture owners, very positive, seems to be a sort of like a recategorization of Jews and Christians under one umbrella, and trying to invite them to believe in the Prophet Muhammad. And I would think that also Banu Israel and Yahud were words that were used by the Medinan Jews themselves. might have a little bit of disagreement with Nikolai there. So when you look at Sabæic material, the words Yahud and Hud appear there, not on several occasions, but here and there, and at least some of them, in my opinion, are sort of self-identifications used by the group itself. The clearest example, in my opinion, is this inscription. I'm sorry that the published photo is really bad. You cannot really make out any, Sabæic letter marks there, but it's a deed, and we just have to trust the published edition of the text. So it's a deed specifying the uses of a graveyard, and this graveyard is close to a synagogue, Makraban, which is called God is my rock. So it would seem to be definitely, I would prefer the interpretation that this graveyard was founded by Jews themselves, and also the epigraphic text was written by the Jewish community, and you have a plural of Jews present in that inscription. So just to point that out. When we go to the Quran, I mentioned that the Meccan surahs are quite positive about the Israelites. Of course, the term Banu Israel might also include some Christians in some instances, but mostly it seems to talk about Jews and talk to Jews. And once again, for instance, in Surah 6, verse 20, there's it's a passage where it says that the people of the book actually believe in the Quran, they know it as their sons, and so this seems to be the case in the Meccan religious environment, that there were some or several Jews and perhaps Christians joining the movement and believing in Muhammad. And then we have in the Surah 6 we have a Medinan edition mentioning the Jews, I think as al-Ladina Hadu, if I remember correctly. And so this has been argued by Nikolai to be a Medinan edition, which it might be. Of course, it's quite possible that also already the Meccan Quran uses the word Jews, al-Ladina Hadu, or some other formulation for this religious group. And then when we go to the Medinan Quran, and supposing that the mean verse length gives us tools to date roughly, at least, these surahs. Of course, I subscribe to the opinion that they grew over the years. There was stuff added, as Nikolai just showed to us, so we cannot really treat them as sort of monolithic units, but they include a lot of material. But supposing that Surah 3 includes quite a bit of early material, it seems that this polemics, anti-Jewish polemics begins very early in the Medinan Quran, and it sort of continues throughout all the way to Surah al-Ma'idah, Surah al-Tawbah, if we date those as the last Medinan surahs, or the surahs to include very late Medinan material. Very similar sort of anti-Jewish polemics seem to be included there as well. And I'm taking here a sort of like a bird's eye view. I cannot go into minute details about any of these verses, and many of them have already been treated today, so that's good. So, and Surah al-Baqarah has been mentioned. The idea that especially this very long passage where there's a lot of anti-Jewish polemics, anti-Israelite polemics, but then we have also here and there sort of more positive takes on them, mention that God has blessed the Israelites, and now the Quran calls them to sort of honor their sacred history and believe in the Prophet Muhammad as well. And then, interestingly enough, this verse 262 in Surah al-Baqarah, which has a doublet in Surah al-Ma'idah, verse 69, mentions that the Jews, perhaps also those Jews that are not believing in the Prophet Muhammad, can receive the heavenly reward if they are otherwise pious. So you have sort of balance of anti-Jewish and more pro-Jewish materials. And what is interesting in these passages is that it seems to me that there is a continuous presence of the Jews in Medina. They are not expelled, they are addressed quite often. And as Holger suggested, we might envision certain settings where the Prophet Muhammad is proclaiming the Quran, certain Quranic passages to the Medinan Jews, and those passages included in Holger's reconstruction and very credible. So very late material from Surah al-Ṭiwāl, which is important here. And also I would point out that even though the anti-Jewish polemics in certain instances seem very overarching, I think that there in certain instances of the Quran there are quite a few remarks that humankind in general consists of transgressors and sinful people. There are at least a couple of such verses, and then also other groups are heavily censored. For instance, the nomads, al-Arab, the picture that we get from them or of them is very negative. Only some of them, minority of them, are believers. If we try to find conflict with the Jews in the Quran, there's very little of that. Of course, Surah al-Hashr, which is not Quran 59, which is not part of the 7 long ones, but I'll mention here because it's important, mentions actual conflict with the Jews, or actually talks about al-Kitab. It doesn't mention Yahud at all, but if we, as I think is probable, envision Medina to having been majority Jewish, or at least heavily Jewish, probably the group that the Quran has in mind when talking about al-Kitab in the Medinan period is the Jews very much. What is important to, of course, note is that in Surah al-Hashr and also Surah al-Tawbah 29, the famous verse on Jizya that was mentioned by Karen Bauer before, it is, in both instances, it is emphasized that the conflict is with some of the people of the book, not all of them. So there's no blanket permission to fight all of them, but some of them. And especially Surah al-Hashr is very, very clear about that. When it comes to Surah al-Ma'idah, which probably holds very late material, probably the latest material, even though, as we saw in Mohsen's talk, we can also probably imagine that even this surah underwent certain developments, and material related to Christians might have been inserted there. Anyway, I think the quite clear consensus among scholars in Quranic studies is that Surah al-Ma'idah is very late indeed. So maybe we should look there as well. There are two recent studies reading Surah al-Ma'idah both by Mohsen and myself, and we agree on certain things and disagree on certain things. And here too we have a similar situation, continuation of the Medinan Quranic categorization of the Jews, where they are portrayed as mostly in a negative fashion, but then there are also some positive remarks on them, supposing once again that the people of the book mentioned in Surah al-Ma'idah refers in particular, but not exclusively, to the Jews. For instance, what is important, we have the doublet on Surah al-Baqarah, verse 62, in Surah al-Ma'idah, verse 69, promising some sort of salvific reward to Jews as well. Then we have at the beginning of the surah, we have emphasis. This is actually the surah that permits the food of the Ahlul Kitab to be consumed, intermarriage. So once again, I wouldn't say that there's a categorical parting of the ways. Mohsen's reading is very interesting here, where he reads it in tandem with the Constitution of Medina, to be mentioned later, and he sees that this is this surah, Surah al-Ma'idah, ended the alliance of the Constitution of Medina with some Medinan Jews. So he sees that there's a break, but this is a very late break. And what Mohsen emphasized is that there's no evidence in this surah of any violent punishment against the Medinan Jews. In fact, he says that the Prophet Muhammad was not in that position that he could have been able to do that. And then both of us treat this verse 5:3, which famously says that God has favored for you al-Islam dinan, which in sort of conventional understanding has been interpreted as mentioning Islam as the religion that God has now chosen for the believers. Both Mohsen and I think that that's probably anachronistic, and our interpretations differ. I read this saying that God has chosen obedience, al-Islam, as regards law, dinan, because of the whole beginning of Surah al-Ma'idah has to do with law, purity, intermarriage, food, ritual washing as well. So I think it is at least a plausible interpretation. So, I mean, as you can see in this historically accurate painting of created by co-pilot, and in the Quranic verses, I think even the late strata of the Quran indicate that there were Jews still present in Medina up to the death of the Prophet Muhammad, or up to the very latest stages of the Quran at least. And then when we go to the post-Quranic non-Arabic sources, and you know, some of them written by Jews and Christians, they note that there were some sort of connections between the Arabian believers and conquerors and Jews, and this has been interpreted, or these have been interpreted in many different ways. And I think, of course, the texts might be evidence of various phenomena in various settings. Gregor Scheller and Andres Görke, for instance, note in their recent book, the English version of the German one, say that the chronicle of Sebeos, or attributed to Sebeos, speaks of local Palestinian Jews joining the followers of Muhammad. Then very interesting forthcoming book by Hassan Rohe mentions or tries to understand this these texts speaking of Meccan Jews that he endeavors to identify on the basis of genealogical literature. It's a very interesting book, very important. I hope it comes out soon. I myself would add Medinan Jews there as a possible explanation. Let me explain that in detail. So I think the solution is actually pretty obvious when we look at it like that, and the solution is offered to us by the Constitution of Medina. If we want to reconcile the sources, sort of read them in tandem. Like I mentioned, even though it's quoted by later authors, most notably by Abu Ubaid and Ibn Hisham, the vast majority of the scholars treat the Constitution of Medina as an authentic text, going back in some form to the time of the Prophet Muhammad. All right, and these are the Jewish groups that it mentions, and I would like you to keep in mind the inscription from 303 Common Era, which mentions in Arabic the Jewish feast of Passover. So these are Medinan tribes, and we'll look at them in more closely in the next slide. Many scholars have thought that these mentions of Yahud, Bani, Ax in the Constitution mention Jewish clients of Arab tribes, Arabic-speaking tribes. But I mean, as I've shown, even 300 years before the time of the Prophet Muhammad, they were Arabic-speaking Jews. There's nothing sort of impossible about Jewish Arabs and Jewish groups among the Medinan Arabs. And I think it hasn't been emphasized enough in the literature, but what you have in the Constitution is actually Ausi and Khazraji tribes or clans. So Yahud, Bani, Aus is mentioned as it seems to point that there was a Jewish presence in the whole of Aus, and then you have 5 different Khazraji clans mentioned, and most genealogical literature gives 6 clans to Khazraj. Maybe there were some minor ones as well, but it would seem that, you know, in both of these major Medinan tribes there was a Jewish presence. And importantly, of course, in the Constitution it is talking about Jewish groups that are on the side of the Prophet Muhammad. Maybe we can say that they are actually called believers in the Constitution. There's a debate on that, but at least to a certain degree they are allies or even group members of the community of believers. And this hasn't been, I think, emphasized enough, and most classical Arabic sources don't really acknowledge that there were Ausi and Khazraji Jews in Medina. Al-Yaqubian is an exception. On the basis of this text, the Constitution of Medina, even though he doesn't adduce it, it seems that he read it and says that some of the Aus and Khazraj also became Jews. And he says that this is due to their living as neighbors of the Qurayza and Nadir, but of course that's his interpretation of the events. And then various scholars, as Michael Lecker, have been able to identify that in classical Arabic sources, some of the famous figures, or not so famous figures in some cases, are actually treated as coming from a Jewish background. So it goes quite neatly with what we see in the Constitution of Medina, such as Zayd ibn Thabit, who was from An-Najjar, and at least according to certain narratives, he was of Jewish background. So I think what you have here is you have the main tribes of Medina, and of course we can debate if they were the main tribes, but that's my assumption. They had a Jewish component. This is not usually thought to be the case, as I mentioned. For instance, Michael Muhammad Knight, in a recent book, Who is Muhammad, says that these tribes were major polytheist tribes, and I think that's a very kind of common understanding that before, in pre-Islamic era, they were polytheists, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. Of course, I'm not saying that all of Aus and Khazraj were Jews. I'm saying that there were Jewish individuals and groups among them. And as I mentioned before, the sira addresses conflict with other Jewish tribes, Medinan tribes. So maybe it is possible to, critically read the sira, but try to reconcile the evidence and take up all the evidence at the same time. Also, as I mentioned, the Quran does not seem to evidence a sort of total break with the Jews. It actually seems to be evidence of a continuous presence of Medinan Jews. All right. And I would think that those non-Arabic sources that I mentioned in passing, at least to a certain degree, they are talking about these Aus and Khazraji Jews who were part of the conquering army, and who both the Jewish and Christian authors in the Near East were describing as belonging to the army and at least rooting for them. Okay, I don't know what that is. So this would be the situation in my reading. I think it's probably true that An-Nadir and Qainuqa were expelled, Qurayza killed or enslaved, but we have the Ausi and Khazraji Jews who are believers in Muhammad, and then we probably have several other Jews from other tribes who are sort of neutral or in the gray area. That would be my understanding, and maybe these would be the Jews that then the Quran debates at the later stage of the development. And one, of course, important thing that I would like to note, one last point, is that this. So I problematize the notion with of the break with the Jews, but also this concept of the three great Jewish tribes, which is repeated often in scholarship on the biography of the Prophet and in other works. I think this should be questioned to a degree. So I think they were real tribes, but were they really that great in size? For instance, Qainuqa is not even mentioned in many sources. So if they were a real tribe, it was probably quite small, and maybe we should actually look